When I first looked at my mother sitting on that very bench she had always dominated, her face contorted with an abyss of resentment and guilt, I realized that I no longer wanted to play her games. The trial wasn't just a battle over the apartment, it had become the culmination of a lifetime filled with her manipulations, empty promises, and injustices. Over the years, I had learned to endure, forgive, and forget. But now I stood at a decisive crossroads, beyond which there would be no turning back. My name is Edwidge, and I grew up in a small house that always smelled of freshly baked bread. My father had inherited the family bakery from his parents, and I enjoyed helping him with the dough after school. It was my little kingdom, where the scent of yeast and flour became as familiar and inseparable as life itself. My mother, on the other hand, was different. She was a realtor, always dressed in sharp suits and high heels, bringing in more money than my father ever had. But to be honest, despite the material achievements, there wasn't much happiness in our home. Once, when I was 12, I came home to set the table, as usual, and heard my mother's voice, which always carried an undertone of irritation, even when she was speaking to us. I already knew what lay behind it. Her voice was cold and restrained, the kind that only comes from people who can't escape their own chains. My father, by contrast, was gentle and patient as always, but, as always, it didn't save him from her aggression. I remember how, while setting the plates on the table, I suddenly felt an electric tension in the air. Standing by the window, my mother shouted at my father, "When will you ever get your act together?" Her words dripped with such contempt that I felt embarrassed. I didn't turn around, but I knew she was talking about money again. My father's response was soft, almost pleading, "Sarah, please, don't." But it didn't calm her. My mother couldn't control herself, and her words were venomous as always. She turned sharply to him and said, "How can you be such a weakling? You've always been this way, and Edwidge will turn out the same." I didn't know how to respond. It was an ordinary scene in our house. My mother humiliated my father, and my father tried to keep the peace, preventing the situation from spiraling out of control. I grabbed the edge of the table, clenching my fingers, but I didn't cry. It was such a familiar scene that the tears no longer came. I had learned to be as quiet and inconspicuous as possible, to avoid drawing attention to myself. If anyone had told me that these scenes weren't normal, I wouldn't have believed them. I was too young to understand the full depth of what was happening between them. Still, at some point, I decided that I had to be strong. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie silence in the house. There was no smell of baking bread, no clicking of my mother's heels. I went downstairs and saw my father sitting at the kitchen table, his face burnt with an expression of hopelessness. "Where is Mom?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Deep down, I knew. My father silently handed me a note written in her elegant handwriting. I unfolded it and read, "Germano, I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving with Amendo. He can give me the life I deserve, not this city nonsense." It felt as though my chest had tightened, as if struck. My mother had left. She had left us, leaving only this note full of bitterness and despair. She hadn't even bothered to look at me. It seemed like the world was falling apart around me. I couldn't believe it was happening to us. The mother who had always said we could have everything if we worked hard had left us. By the time I received that note, the pain was so sharp that I wanted to scream. But I couldn't. I just stood there, unable to move. My father filed for divorce and sought to strip her of parental rights. The legal proceedings became a nightmare, and I realized our lives would never be the same again. I remember sitting in the cold courthouse, my hand tightly gripping my father's, as we waited for my mother. She never showed up. I tried to distract myself from the adults' conversations, focusing on something else. But all I heard were the words abandonment and incompetent parent. When it was all over, my father squeezed my hand. "It's over, Edwidge," he said quietly. It felt like a blow to the head. It was over. From that day on, life became much harder. My father immersed himself in work, and I, as the eldest, took on the responsibility of the house. I came home from school, did my homework, then cooked dinner and did the laundry. My father and I became each other's only support, but I could feel that there was something more between us, a void that no one could fill. This routine went on for 3 years, until everything suddenly changed right after my 15th birthday. It was the day I felt that life would finally bring something good. I had just returned from school when my father came into the house, his face filled with shock and sorrow. He sat down on a kitchen chair, as if unable to move. In an instant, I felt the air around us thicken, as though it was a harbinger of trouble. "Uncle Pete died," he said, his voice soft, almost broken. I didn't immediately understand how this news would affect me. I went over to him, hugged him tightly, trying to give him even a small amount of warmth and support. My father, a little calmer, pulled back, his eyes wide, and said, "Edwidge, you won't believe it. He left me everything, almost $300,000. I'm his only living relative. I don't know what to do with it." I stared at him, stunned. It was a large sum, but I could see how it tortured him, giving him no peace. After gathering himself, my father invested some of the money in the bakery. He upgraded the equipment, improved the interior, and expanded the menu. We both looked at our little bakery in a new light, as though it were a new chance, new opportunities. Just a few months later, our bakery became the talk of the town. My father hired more staff, extended the hours, and expanded the range. The business took off. And before we knew it, he opened a second location on the other side of town. By the time I was 16, my father owned 3 thriving bakeries. Our financial troubles were a thing of the past, and I felt like I no longer had to worry about tomorrow. I quit my after-school job to focus on my studies, and we were able to afford our first real vacation, a trip to Europe for 2. I will never forget walking down the old streets of Paris, laughing and enjoying every moment. That was our freedom, our reward for everything we had gone through. My mother remained a distant, blurry shadow in my memory. Dad and I didn't often talk about her. He dated women, but none of them left a mark on his life. He was still as gentle, restrained, and attentive as he had always been, but now his world revolved around me. I was his support, and he was mine. We were happy in the way we could be, without needing words for what wasn't there. My school years passed in a fog, unremarkable but important, filled with the exhaustion of exams and graduation parties, tossing caps, and tearful embraces. But in these gray days, there was also certainty. I was working on myself, and it was starting to pay off. After finishing school, I enrolled in State University, deciding to study finance. I dreamed of building a career that, I thought, would allow me to do everything for Dad that he had done for me. Before I left for university, Dad handed me a small box. "What's this?" I asked, not understanding what was inside. When I opened it, I found a key. Dad smiled and said, "Your graduation gift, a flat near campus. No more worrying about dorms or rent." I stood there, mouth agape, unable to say a word. "Dad, I can't, this is too much." I started, but he interrupted me. "You've earned this, Edwidge. Now go and make me proud." I stayed silent, feeling his words burn inside me, sparking a fire of responsibility in my chest. The years at college flew by in the blink of an eye. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make the most of the opportunity Dad had given me. In my free time, I interned at local financial companies, and when I graduated, I already had a job as a junior financial analyst. On my first day at the new job, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, straightened my suit, and told myself, "Edwidge, you can do this." I knew that now, all doors were open to me. The work was challenging, but I derived real satisfaction from it. Every bonus and promotion, I invested rather than spent. Dad's voice echoed in my head, "Money makes money, Edwidge, be smart." Those words were my guiding star. By the time I turned 32, my smart investments had started paying off. I owned several apartments that brought in steady rental income. I felt like everything in my life was finally falling into place. But then, one phone call changed everything. Dad's voice was tense, his words full of worry. "Edwidge, can you come? I need to talk to you about something." I heard something in his voice I hadn't before, a fear he couldn't hide. I rushed to him. He was sitting at the kitchen table. His face seemed older than I had ever seen it. "What's going on, Dad?" I asked, my heart squeezing with fear. He sighed deeply, his gaze heavy. "It's cancer, sweetie. Stage 4. Pancreatic." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Is this it?" I whispered in a daze, "No, it can't be. It's a mistake." But it wasn't. I couldn't help but notice how Bianca, despite her young age, kept avoiding eye contact, her head bowed low. She was like me, a girl who hadn't had a mother, just like I hadn't. It gave me a strange feeling, like I was seeing the reflection of my own past in her constrained figure. But unlike me, she didn't have what I had known. She didn't have the strength that came from living with my father, his care, his belief in me. And at that moment, I realized I didn't care about her mother. I only thought about Bianca, the one who grew up like me, with a void in place of a mother. Mom said that she wasn't making excuses for her actions, that she didn't blame anyone for her weakness. I felt a chill in my chest when I heard these words. It was all so childish. She didn't realize that her actions hadn't just cost her life, but had also shaped mine, the life I had lived with the emptiness left by her leaving. Dad was my everything, and no matter how hard she tried, she could no longer bring me back to the world that had existed before she left. I didn't expect anything from her. And yet, I sat there, listening to her, giving a chance to something that couldn't be fixed. "You can stay here," I said, thinking again about Bianca. "But only until you find a job. I have an apartment available, it just became free. There won't be any issues with rent, just utilities." Mom nodded with gratitude, but I saw how her eyes darkened for a moment when she realized that nothing else was expected from her. But I was no longer that girl who needed her love. I was a woman who had learned to be strong, even in her absence. And though I felt sorry for Bianca, I knew she had to walk this path on her own. After our conversation, Mom and Bianca left, and I stayed sitting in the cafe, lost in my thoughts. I didn't know what to do with this new weight on my shoulders, but there was no choice. Time doesn't stop, and there's always room for new decisions, even if they're not always easy. I decided I needed to distract myself from these thoughts, or I'd go crazy. When I got home, I returned to my usual routine, meetings with tenants, calls, papers, and reports. It all seemed empty and meaningless, but in that, I felt control. I was the master of my world, creating it by my own rules. But as the evening began to fall over the city and the apartment grew dark, I still felt the weight, invisible to the eyes. Inside, there was still that small corner left by my mother and father, and now I felt it open up again. It was the place where I once dreamed of a different life, a life with a full family, with a love that wouldn't leave. Now, I was building my life differently, not trying to restore what was lost, but creating something new. Time passed, and it got easier. I no longer obsessed over every detail, trying to make up for lost years. I learned to forgive. But that didn't mean I'd become who I was before. I learned to keep my distance, so I wouldn't fall into the trap that had once been offered to me. I understood that love isn't always what we think it is. It doesn't come when called, and it's not always healthy. In this world, you have to be able to stand on your own, and I had learned that. I kept working, managing real estate, and thinking about a future that might not be exactly what I had imagined. But now I could shape it on my own terms, and, as strange as it sounded, I was content with what I had. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every word my mother spoke felt like a hammer, shaking my memories. She was essentially claiming that something was owed to her, as though I owed her for everything she had, or hadn't, done for me. And of course, her final blow was aimed at Bianca. How easily she used her daughter, her needs and hopes, to manipulate me. I stood before her, not knowing how to respond. She looked as though she had just fought for her life, her face flushed and her eyes flashing with fury, but inside, I felt nothing but emptiness. All her words seemed utterly hollow, as if she were playing her own part, not realizing that her theater had long been closed. "You don't understand," I finally said, trying to keep my calm, but my voice betrayed me, trembling. "This isn't just about money. It's not something I owe you or Bianca. It's not a way to make up for your mistakes. You left me once, and you can't expect me to be here again, lifting your burdens." Mom took a step toward me, her fingers clenched into a fist, but I kept speaking, not paying attention to her tension. "You left. You left me when I needed you the most. You didn't see me grow, you didn't see me struggle. You didn't see how I filled the voids left by your absence. And now you think you can just show up and demand your share." She fell silent, and in her gaze, I saw sparks of confusion, but also some resentment. I understood that it was hard for her to accept that her return wasn't expected with warmth and joy. But it was too late. I wasn't that girl who once sat by the window, hoping for her to come back. I had become someone else, a grown, independent woman who had learned to live without her. "You don't have the right to demand anything," I added, and at that moment, I no longer felt any pity or doubt in my chest. This was a statement. And although I was speaking to her, I was also speaking to myself. "All you need to understand is that I am no longer your responsibility. I've built my life, and it doesn't include you." Mom stood still, and I saw her face change, something inside her breaking, but she couldn't justify herself. She tried to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. "I've already done more for you than you ever did for me. You can try to manipulate Bianca, but I won't let you use her in your games," I said, finally letting go of her gaze and stepping back. At some point, fully realizing that this conversation was over, I turned and headed for the door. When I closed the door, everything around me became muffled. Mom stayed out there, with her beliefs and imagined rights, but I could no longer give her any more space in my life. I returned to myself, back to my reality, where only I decided whom and what to let into my space. Although everything inside me had turned upside down, I felt the heavy burden lift. Maybe I was a little harsh, maybe I could have been softer. But I knew it was a necessity. Mom wasn't coming back. There wouldn't be the maternal love I had so desperately needed. But I didn't expect it anymore. I didn't need her justifications or returns. I had learned to survive without her. And perhaps, in that, lay my real success. The next few days passed slowly. I didn't feel relief or guilt. Just emptiness, which finally started to fill up. Bianca was still part of my life, but I no longer knew what role she should play in this new, strange picture. Mom kept talking, her voice so loud and sharp that I could barely make out her words. Each of her statements felt like an attack directed at me. I sat there, holding the phone, feeling how her words turned into stones, heavy and crashing against my chest. She left me no chance to defend myself, and in that, there was something more destructive than her accusations. She wasn't just asking for help, she was showing contempt, her certainty that I owed her something. And what troubled me the most was that she truly believed that her rights to me and my life hadn't been lost. "I don't know how you could change so much," her voice became sharp, like the point of a knife. "Remember who raised you. How could you forget your mother? Your family? Every word she spoke was like an angry flash. I felt the noise in my ears, the blood freezing in my veins. I tried over and over to find words to answer her, but nothing came out. All I could do was stand there and listen to how her accusations dissolved into emptiness. And at that moment, I realized that her word, family, didn't mean the same to her as it did to me. She spoke of it as if it were property, something she needed to control and own. In her eyes, we were not people, not mother and daughter, but parts of her life that she had the right to dispose of as she saw fit. She wasn't seeking reconciliation, wasn't hoping to restore the relationship. Her goal was clear: to reclaim everything she had lost. "You've got it all wrong," I finally said, when the clouds in my mind seemed to clear. "Family isn't something you can take. It's not your property. You can't just come up and demand that I become who you want. I've been through a lot to become myself. And it was you who left me. You weren't there." Mom fell silent. I could hear her breathing heavily, as if she were trying to say something, but the words got stuck on her tongue. Finally, after a long pause, she exhaled. "You think I don't know how much it hurt you?" Her voice became weak, almost pleading. "I suffered too. You don't think it was easy for me when I left?" But there was no regret in her words. It was just a repetition of a phrase she had been trying to convince herself of, to justify everything she had done. "If you really suffered, you would have stayed," I said quietly, feeling my shoulders tense from the pressure. "But you chose another life. And I stayed. And you don't have the right to blame me for choosing my own. You left, and now I have to decide how to live." She was silent, and the silence between us grew deafening and heavy. I realized I was no longer expecting anything from her. I had stopped hoping that she would change or recognize what she had done. There were no more excuses. The entire process of rising from the ashes had been my own work, and I wasn't about to hand it over to anyone else again. When I hung up the phone, I felt empty, yet somehow freed. A deep sigh escaped my chest, and the world seemed to settle just a little. But inside me, that heavy, piercing pain still lingered, refusing to go away. I understood that from now on, all my energy had to go into rebuilding myself, into living on without her presence in my life. A few days later, when the situation with my mom continued to unfold, I found myself back in that same cafe where everything had begun. My gaze swept over the table, and I saw her, Bianca. She was sitting there, nervously fiddling with her cup, and when she noticed me, her eyes immediately filled with anxiety. I felt how her gaze pierced through me, almost asking what I expected from her. She knew, too, everything that was happening concerned her as much as it did me. We were bound by this strange thread, and I couldn't quite understand which side she would choose in the end, mine or Mom's. I entered the courtroom, and my steps echoed in the silence, which suddenly felt tangible, like a living thing. My gaze immediately fell on my mother, sitting opposite me, in threatening proximity. In her eyes, I saw that familiar fire, not pain, but judgment, which I had tried to ignore for so long. She looked exhausted, but her restrained, tense face betrayed the fear I hadn't yet seen in her eyes. She knew that today, everything could change. And next to her sat Bianca, my sister. She looked as though she had dreamed of becoming invisible this whole time. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, and her hands twisted the edge of her clothes, as if trying to erase her involvement in what was happening. My own sister, who had grown up in the same toxic atmosphere as I had, but, unlike me, hadn't tried to escape from that hell. It seemed like she didn't even know what to do, didn't understand which side to take. The judge, in his stern manner, asked both of us to approach the stand. I felt all my strength leave me, my knees growing weak, but I forced myself not to give in. I raised my head and met the gaze of the one I had once called my mother. A sneer still lingered on her face, as if she were enjoying the fact that she could deny me this final victory, this chance to finally break free from her clutches. The judge, after glancing at the documents and carefully listening to both sides, proposed a compromise. I held back a laugh. Reconciliation, a compromise with the woman who had taken away from me the most precious things, time, trust, love, seemed impossible. But I couldn't let myself give in to emotions. I knew this was my last opportunity, my final chance to leave her behind. I was ready for any pain, but not for another lie. The judge asked us both to present our arguments. Mom, still frowning and knitting her brows, stood first, spoke a few words, and I understood that her tirade wasn't an admission of guilt. It was yet another attempt to manipulate me, to hide her guilt behind a mask of self-righteousness. I gave her my entire life, she declared. And she can't even help me in my old age. How can she do this to me after everything I've done for her? Her words didn't make me flinch like they once had. I could no longer believe these complaints she repeated so often. I could see her, the woman who had always placed herself above everyone, including her own daughter. She wasn't ready for the fact that I was standing here, in this courtroom, before her, demanding justice. When it was my turn, I felt how hard it was to gather my thoughts, as if my inner world was turning upside down when I realized that none of this would end with just one court decision. I spoke of how all these years I had endured her manipulations, her aggression, her demands. I reminded her how she had never cared for me, how she had abandoned me when I was still a child, and how she had never taken responsibility for her actions. I'm not asking her to love me, I said. But I'm asking for justice. I'm asking for respect as a person, not as an object she can use for her own purposes. Saying this, I felt how my words gradually gained strength, how long-forgotten feelings were freed from all their restraints. I remembered the moment when I last tried to find something good in her. I realized that I could no longer continue playing this game. When the judge had listened to both of us, he asked if we could reach a decision without court intervention. But I knew that wasn't possible. I was willing to do anything to sever ties with her world, to leave everything behind and live my life, free from her shadow, free from her manipulations. The judge proposed several solutions, but I felt that, despite everything, I couldn't agree to any of them. This compromise would be just another illusion, another step toward ending up back under her control. When the hearing was over, I left the courtroom with a sense of emptiness, but also with a small, barely perceptible spark of hope. I didn't know what would happen next, didn't know how the case would unfold, but I knew one thing: would never again allow her to control my life. The court proceedings began, and Mom put on a real performance. It was exactly what I had expected, and even more. She cried so loudly that it felt like the entire courtroom's walls were vibrating with her fear and despair. Her voice cracked as she addressed the judge, as though she couldn't believe she had to resort to such methods to justify her actions. "Your Honor," she said with a tone of complaint, "my daughter has become so heartless that she is trying to throw her own mother and sister out onto the street after everything I've done for her." Each of her words was like a slap in the face. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to give in, not to fall for her manipulation, not to show the slightest weakness. Mom was a master of drama, and every move, every glance she made was designed to make me feel guilty. But now I understood that my guilt was an illusion she had created to keep me in her grasp. At that moment, my lawyer stood up and signaled to begin the counteraction. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as he started speaking in a calm and confident voice, presenting all the facts I had kept inside for so long but hadn't been able to express. "Your Honor," he said, "would like to present some evidence that paints an entirely different picture of what's been happening. My client has endured actions that not only violated her rights but also her personal life for many years." He went on, recounting how my mother had abandoned me when I was only 12 years old. How she failed to fulfill her parental duties and didn't pay child support, leaving me and Bianca to fend for ourselves. His words struck the courtroom, as everything I had kept hidden from outsiders became part of the official record. He introduced documents, the rental agreement, unpaid utility bills. All of this was proof that my efforts to maintain any kind of normal relationship with my mother had been in vain. But that was just the beginning. The lawyer continued. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mrs. Stevens is not, in fact, in financial distress as claimed. She owns an apartment in another city, which was left to her by her former partner. She is currently renting out the property and receiving a significant monthly income. Silence fell in the courtroom. The judge turned to my mother, his expression grew more severe, and he asked her if this was true. My mother's face went pale, and she opened and closed her mouth several times, as if trying to find an excuse, but her words escaped in a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. At that moment, I felt everything inside me tighten, and I realized that this was the moment of truth. My mother hadn't just been manipulating me, she had consciously used me as a tool to preserve her life unchanged, without responsibility. In that moment, I understood that I had lost not only her but also the illusion that I could ever find even a drop of real love and care in her. The judge lowered his gaze, and his voice became cold and decisive, like the strike of a hammer. This court rules for eviction. Furthermore, Mrs. Stevens is required to pay the outstanding rent for the period during which she occupied the apartment rent-free. I felt my heart skip a beat, and the air in the courtroom suddenly grew heavy. This wasn't just the end of the legal proceedings, it was the end of an entire era. My victory wasn't a celebration. It was a liberation from her power, from her control. When we left the courtroom, I noticed Bianca. She was sitting on a bench, looking lost and embarrassed, her eyes filled with tears. My heart tightened. I knew this wasn't her fault. She was just as trapped by our mother as I had been. I walked over to her, ignoring the gaze of my mother, which felt like it was piercing me. My hand trembled as I offered my sister my help. Bianca, I said softly, I'm sorry that it's come to this. If you need help, real help, you can still get it. Bianca looked at me, her lips trembling, and tears filled her eyes. She nodded quietly and said, barely holding back sobs, I'm sorry, Edwidge. I didn't know. I gave her a faint smile and, unable to hold back, quickly walked away, feeling as though all the weight was leaving me. The burden I had carried on my shoulders all these years was slowly lifting. But inside, despite this liberation, there was a certain emptiness. My emotions were tangled in my mind. It wasn't easy, but I knew one thing, I had won. I had managed to defend my life. A few weeks passed, and my mother and Bianca moved into a different apartment. I heard about it through rumors but didn't try to reach out to them. And they didn't contact me either. I stood in the empty apartment, and the memories of the last months of my life involuntarily returned. I remembered the pain of betrayal, the stress of the legal battles, but deep inside, I felt how long-awaited freedom was awakening within me.